My name is Dr. Melissa McCann. This video is a summary of the COVID vaccine injury class action. Please feel free to use and share this information. The website for the class action is found here, with more information on the claim, including links to join and link to the fundraising page. This action has been filed in the Federal Court, New South Wales Registry, by NR Barbie's solicitor, acting on behalf of the lead applicants and all other COVID-19 vaccine-injured parties, against, at least, the Australian Government, the Department of Health and Aged Care Secretary Dr. Brandon Murphy, and the Deputy Secretary of the Health Products Regulation Group, Adjunct Professor John Skerritt. And this action has been commenced with a genuine steps statement and a comprehensive statement of claim that totals more than 650 pages. And this claim document can be found on the class action website. With ongoing and soon to be worsening censorship, most people are still not aware of the action, so please share. Also, a link to the crowdfunding. So our fundraising platform is securely hosted on our own website, and we've raised so far more than $200,000. And regarding the funding, if the action succeeds, all donations will be returned. I have signed on as funder, have donated personally, and continue to donate regularly to ensure all legal fees are paid on time. And I've also guaranteed for the injured that should the action fail, I will be responsible for adverse costs so that the injured and bereaved can join with confidence. And if or when the action wins, no person takes any cut or percentage from the compensation, not myself or the lawyers or anyone else. So running the action in this way, by not using a no-win, no-fee law firm and not using a commercial litigation funder, means that we are reliant on donations to run the case, but it means the injured will receive the highest possible compensation. I wanted to avoid the situation where a class action could win, but the arrangement with the lawyers or a commercial funder resulted in the victims ending up with only a small amount, as has happened in previous class actions. However, to continue in this way, we need to fundraise very soon another $600,000, and we are asking for just a $1 donation from 600,000 people to continue this historic action. So about the action, the applicant alleges that the respondents' actions to advance the acceptance and use of the various approved COVID-19 vaccines constitutes negligence and/or misfeasance, and further alleges that such negligence and misfeasance caused the class members to suffer loss or damage. I will present some of the facts and allegations that form part of the statement of claim. Importantly, these points are currently just allegations until the matter is determined by the court. So firstly, the claim establishes that the respondents had the responsibility for approval decisions and a number of statutory obligations under the Therapeutic Goods Act, and the public was reassured of the respondents' competence in carrying out these responsibilities.
If Professor Skerritt gives it the tick, then I'm happy to take the jab.
And the allegation of the inflated risk of COVID infection, where it was known that the actual threat of COVID was a case fatality rate of around 1 in 100 for those over the age of 65 years, and in persons aged under 49 years was 5 in 10,000, and that not one person under the age of 50 had died from COVID at the time of vaccine approval. And that it was known at the time of approval, and remains the case, that the median age of death from COVID is 81 years for males and 86 years for females, in a population where this age of death from COVID is equal to the median life expectancy. And that death rates were inflated, whereby those dying with COVID had comorbidities in 93% of people, and COVID was listed as the sole cause of death in only 7% of cases. And the action will allege that the respondents made false and misleading statements with respect to the risk from COVID in order to encourage increased vaccine uptake.
My view is that the case fatality rate is around 1%.
The risk of dying from COVID, if you're over 70, is 1 in 10.
And regarding the provisional approval pathway, this is not the same as the US emergency use approval. Provisional determination allowed the companies to submit for approval when data was not yet available due to ongoing trials, and this data could be submitted on a rolling basis. Importantly, the TGA guidelines state that for a provisional registration application, you must satisfactorily establish the safety and efficacy of the medicine, including a positive risk-benefit balance based on the preliminary clinical data. And this was confirmed publicly by the respondents.
That we have deliberately gone through the normal full range of regulatory approval for our vaccines, safe regulatory approval, have not cut any corners, and we will not register a vaccine unless we're confident about its safety.
And the claim further alleges that it was known that the vaccines possessed exceptional inherent safety risks due to their novel properties, the widespread intended use, and the completely novel and never before used vaccine platform of delivery of RNA in a lipid nanoparticle or DNA material in a viral vector to self-produce the spike protein, and for which they were required to obtain advice from the gene technology regulator, which in the case of the mRNA vaccines was not done. And that despite these inherent risks, it was known that the total time taken for the approvals, from commencement, testing and trials to approval, was 9 months for the Pfizer vaccines, 10 months for AstraZeneca vaccine, and 17 months for the Moderna vaccine. And the claim alleges false and misleading statements were made to minimise concerns about the novel platform or the approval timeline in order to increase vaccination uptake.
Is this thing, because it's been seemingly rushed through overseas, is it going to be safe for us to take it here?
Well, it's important that the public is reassured about the safety of vaccines. Now, every new medicine or vaccine that comes in is closely watched for safety. The reason why they've been developed so quickly is very simple. Money, 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 and billions of dollars. The biggest investment in a new area of medical research and pharmaceutical development, I think, that I've ever known.
What would you say to people that are a bit worried about how fast it's been?
Why things usually take so long is that they're done one after the other. So we usually do, phase 1 studies and then, see what happens, and then, someone has to go and apply for money to get the phase 2 study going, and then it happens like that. What's different about this and why it's so much quicker is that all these things are being done in parallel. So you would never think in a million years in any other vaccine we would make vaccines before we knew that they were effective.
It feels like, just as a lay person, it's kind of a short ramp up of time to get the vaccine, necessarily, of course. So, I guess with other vaccines you have longer to compare the data. Is that fair? Does it matter?
So we had a lot of teams working in parallel on this. A lot longer hours each day and a lot more people working on it.
And that there were known untested groups of people who were regardless indicated by the TGA, such as pregnant and lactating women, people with autoimmune disease or polyethylene glycol allergies, and people who had previously had COVID infection. In addition, the WHO had advised a contraindication for anyone who had previously experienced anaphylaxis to any food or drug due to the high risk of allergic reactions in the Pfizer vaccine. And the case will allege false and misleading statements were made to reassure of safety in those groups, regardless of these cautions. And further, that based on the submitted approval data, that the vaccines were not approved for the indication of preventing serious illness or death from COVID, or to prevent transmission of the virus, as neither before the approvals nor since did the clinical trials meet the secondary trial endpoint of reduction in any serious outcome or reduction in transmission. The only TGA-approved indication for any of these vaccines to this day is the prevention of COVID-19 disease, defined as a positive PCR test, and 2 viral symptoms of any severity. There is no licensed indication for use to prevent transmission or to prevent severe disease and death, nor has there ever been. And the case will allege that false and misleading statements were made in regards to these unapproved indications.
It's highly efficacious. The other really encouraging thing about Moderna is even after 6 months, it's proving to be 93% efficacious against any infection, 98% against severe disease, and 100% against death. It also seems to be quite efficacious against variants, although the company is doing some further work on development of variants.
Is that we are seeing far less deaths than we did last year. The main reason for both of those is, in fact, the vaccine rollout, which has been extraordinarily successful in decreasing death rates in particular.
All of these 3 vaccines have now been shown to be highly effective at preventing clinical COVID disease, and particularly severe COVID disease.
We also don't know how well the vaccines prevent transmission, but there's some pretty good preliminary evidence that they do.
And that the clinical trial data erroneously concluded efficacy in the 90+% ranges due to using relative rather than absolute risk reduction figures. and that absolute risk reduction of contracting symptomatic COVID for the Pfizer product was only 0.7%, with a number needed to treat, that is, the number of doses to prevent one case of symptomatic COVID-19 infection, of 141 doses. And for Moderna, similarly, an absolute risk reduction of only 1.1%. And regarding the safety risk of death following the vaccines, that it was known at the time of approval that 1 in 1,000 elderly patients died when the Pfizer vaccination program commenced in Norway. That despite advising the public that there were no specific risks to the elderly, that John Skerritt had stated in documents obtained under Freedom of Information that the adverse reactions of nausea and diarrhea caused a turn for the worse in fragile patients. And he confirmed that 1 in 1,000 elderly patients had died, and that a document from Pfizer requesting editing and watering down of the draft media release and the product information not containing these specific warnings for doctors around cautions for use in the elderly. I have to say, as a doctor, I find this point especially egregious, because ultimately those in nursing homes may possibly have had a more favourable benefit-risk ratio, even with 1 in 1,000 dying after the vaccine, since if all nursing home residents caught COVID, up to 1 in 100 may have died from COVID. But withholding the information on the deaths from doctors and the public appears deliberately negligent. Had we known this, doctors might have been able to ensure the vaccines were not given to residents who already had poor renal function, or who had recently been unwell and were dehydrated. We could have ensured optimal fluid intake prior to vaccination, and these deaths after vaccines could have been prevented. Instead, I've spoken to many nursing home workers who reported a tragic number of cases of elderly residents dying soon after receiving the vaccine. And these were the vulnerable population that the vaccines were supposed to protect the most. And it was also known in the Pfizer trial that one patient in the clinical trial had a cardiac arrest and died approximately 2 months after the second vaccine. And that one patient in the clinical trial died from a heart attack 3 days after the first Pfizer dose. But the causality was dismissed entirely on the erroneous basis that cardiac arrests and heart attacks are common events in the general population. There were also 8 other events of cardiac arrest, as well as cases of sepsis and metastatic cancers in the clinical trial participants, all of which were simply dismissed by the FDA as unrelated to the vaccine. And that severe adverse events occurred in up to 4.6% of clinical trial participants aged under 55 years. And severe adverse events are those that result in death, hospitalisation, are life-threatening, result in disability or require medical or surgical intervention, or cause a congenital abnormality or defect. And that this rate of severe adverse events was significantly higher than the risk of severe adverse event from COVID infection for those aged under 55. And those severe events occurred more frequently after the second dose compared to the first, which could be considered a re-challenge by causality assessment criteria and is supportive of likely causality. And that for severe adverse events of special interest, those being severe adverse events that are predefined medically as a significant event that may be causally connected to the vaccine, and in the clinical trial for the Pfizer vaccine, a risk difference of 10.1 serious adverse events of special interest per 10,000 vaccine recipients between the vaccine and placebo group. And this provided a harm-benefit ratio of 25, when a harm-benefit ratio of 0.1 or less is considered acceptable for approval. And any ratio greater than 1 indicates literally doing more harm than good with every dose. And these clinical trial results have recently been reviewed by published peer-review literature from independent biostatisticians, who called for a formal harm-benefit analysis of the vaccines. And for the AstraZeneca vaccine, that the clinical trial demonstrated 1 case of multiple sclerosis and 1 case of transverse myelitis and 1 case of autoimmune hemolytic anemia in the clinical trial, which were each highly likely to have been related to the AstraZeneca vaccine, and which were determined unlikely to be related to the vaccine based on the bare assertion of AstraZeneca to that effect, despite having no patient-level data for the TGA to assess themselves. And this claim will allege false and misleading statements were made to increase vaccination uptake, despite the reports of causal deaths in the elderly and the reports of deaths in the clinical trials.
Are any of the vaccines dangerous or going to kill you?
There's no evidence at all that any of the vaccines are dangerous or would kill you. They're all very, very carefully tested by our TGA, which is one of the best regulatory authorities in the world.
Is the health risk of side effects from any of the vaccines greater than the health risks to the community of COVID?
There's no evidence to support that, and we now have quite good evidence of the vaccine rollout in a number of countries where they've needed to do it in an emergency situation, and the evidence suggests that whilst there are some minor side effects, serious side effects are very, very limited, and the risk is much greater of the disease than being vaccinated, much greater.
Pandemic, more than 10 times as many people have died from paracetamol, from Panadol, than from adverse events due to COVID vaccines.
After you've
And yet we're not banning paracetamol.
And turning to the non-clinical trial data, that it was known, for example, for the Pfizer product, that lung inflammation in monkeys was almost identical in the vaccine and placebo group, indicating minimal benefit from the vaccine. And studies of immunogenicity and immunotoxicity to examine, for example, the induction of autoimmune disease were not performed. That pharmacokinetic studies were not performed, distribution studies ceased after just 2 days, and the TGA simply accepted Pfizer's justification to perform these studies due to the products being vaccines, despite the fact the products were never before used gene therapy products. And that no data as to the degradation of the dangerous spike protein was provided or obtained by Pfizer or the TGA. That antibodies declined after just 5 weeks, raising questions about long-term efficacy. And the metabolic studies ceased after just 2 days, and this was despite the fact that the nanolipids were very poorly metabolized and barely cleared from the liver at all, and were present in multiple organs and increasing. How or even if these nanolipids clear from the body or their metabolic pathway is entirely unknown. And these are highly inflammatory nanoparticles, and they distribute across the blood-brain barrier into the neurotissues, spinal cord, bone marrow, heart, and to the ovaries and the testes. And carcinogenicity and genotoxicity studies were also not performed. And this is despite the fact that it has been known for over 60 years that the synthetic lipid adjuvants have an inherent risk of carcinogenicity. For example, the US patent for the aluminium-based vaccine adjuvant discusses the option of using a synthetic or mineral lipid adjuvant for use in vaccines, but stated that it was found that this was not suitable because the mineral oil was not metabolized by the animal host and therefore could be a carcinogen. And Pfizer justified the absence of genotoxicity and carcinogenicity studies in part by using the concept of the threshold of toxicological concern. They referenced the ICH M7 guideline. And this guideline was developed to define an acceptable intake for any unstudied chemical that poses a negligible risk of carcinogenicity. And it gives an acceptable limit of 1.5 micrograms per day. So Pfizer calculated 1.5 micrograms per day times 365 days in a year times 70 years to give a total acceptable lifetime toxicity limit, then divided by 2 for 2 doses per year, and calculated 19,000 micrograms as an acceptable dose for each twice-yearly dosing, and stated this limit was therefore over 300 times the exposure amount for any given dose. However, that very same ICH M7 guideline, which was referred to by Pfizer, but perhaps or allegedly not read by the TGA, as this guideline acknowledged that intermittent higher dosing can have more risk than a continuous low dose, and that in the case of intermittent dosing, the acceptable daily intake should be based on the total number of dosing days, not the time interval over which the dosing occurs. The guideline provides a table and provides an example for a drug administered once a week for 2 years, this being 104 dosing days. And for the twice-yearly dosing, for the Pfizer vaccine over 70 years, is 140 dosing days, or a total of 5 months of dosing days. And the acceptable intake per dose is actually 20 micrograms, not 19,000 as Pfizer calculated. And the threshold is well exceeded in a single dose. And remembering that there were multiple cases of malignancy in the clinical trial, and in the post-marketing surveillance, reporting ratios from the TGA's own data released under Freedom of Information showed elevated proportionality reporting ratio levels for a range of malignant neoplasms, melanoma, lymphoma, leukemia, breast and prostate cancer. And there were also known inherent risks for the mRNA platform, including the risk of the unevaluated RNA regions, with the presence of microRNAs or potential oncomeres being small RNA sequences that cause cancer, which the TGA acknowledged in a Freedom of Information request that they had not evaluated. And the pleading also describes other known issues with the mRNA sequence, including the use of the synthetic pseudoneuridine modified nucleotides, and the RNA untranslated regions and sequences coding for mitochondrial RNA with potential catastrophic consequences. And the non-clinical studies also showed high amounts of pro-inflammatory cytokines, including Th2 cytokines, high levels of eosinophils and enlarged unstained cells, changes in serum chemistry, massive increases in acute phase proteins, as well as infiltration of macrophages. And the claim will allege false and misleading statements in relation to the non-clinical data, in addition to alleging the decision to approve in all of the circumstances was negligent.
So the dose of the lipids in the vaccine is below the threshold that internationally is assessed for genotoxicity and carcinogenicity. I mean, these lipids are commonly used in a range of other human therapeutics, and even at higher levels there isn't evidence of genotoxicity. And they are distributed through a range of parts of the body, as are lipids that you have if you have a sausage or a steak for breakfast.
Yep.
And the lipids are hydrolyzed, destroyed by the body fairly rapidly, as are dietary lipids.
And this is my point, is why hasn't this research been done prior to the rollout?
Well, Senator, if you'd wanted a couple of million people in Australia potentially hospitalised and killed from COVID, you could have had that, because this research takes a couple of years to do.
Well,
so
I realise that.
Sorry, if I can finish my answer, Senator. In order to understand these things, it would have been another year or 2 or 3 until these vaccines would have been released.
The claim further alleges that the non-clinical and clinical data provided evidence for VAED, or vaccine-associated enhanced disease, which is a situation where someone who is vaccinated later contracts the disease that the vaccine is meant to protect against. And that person develops a range of inflammatory consequences, ranging from death to new diseases, worsening of existing diseases, and a vast range of organ damage, and can also cause a prolonged clinical disease course, which might be referred to as long COVID. And regarding potential risks in pregnancy, using Pfizer as one example, the initial category B2, which stated that the fertility and developmental toxicity study in rats showed increased supernumerary lumbar ribs in fetuses from Comirnaty-treated female rats, which statement was removed without explanation, and the category changed to a B1. In fact, this fertility and developmental toxicity study demonstrated, among other matters, an increase in the pre-implantation loss rate of 9.8% in vaccinated versus 4.1% in placebo group rats, effectively a doubling of the equivalent of miscarriage rates in animal studies. And the study demonstrated a variety of other fetal anomalies in the animal studies, as well as one of the pregnant rats developing a solid, dark, heterogeneous mass adherent to the liver tissue, which does sound unequivocally like a liver tumour in this rat, but overall, in the control group, a total of 11 anomalies or malformations from a litter size of 21, and for the Pfizer vaccine group, a total of 28 anomalies or malformations in the same litter size of 21. And this summary table does not even include one of the animals for reasons unknown, DAM number 255, where in the depths of the hundreds of page-long study, we find a report for this rat fetus and the anomaly of situs inversus totalis of the thoracic and abdominal cavities, which is basically a rare and serious congenital abnormality, which is a mirror image transposition of the abdominal and thoracic organs, and a serious fetal anomaly in this animal. And just to be clear, the final categorization of B1 in pregnancy is defined by the TGA as no increase in harmful effects in humans, and studies in animals have not shown evidence of an increased occurrence of fetal damage. And the claim alleges negligence by the respondents to regardless approve in pregnancy despite this data and to provide for category B1 classification. And regarding the approvals in children and young people, using again the example of the Pfizer product, that these were based on clinical efficacy endpoints of antibody response, not on COVID cases, and were approved when the case fatality rate for a young person from COVID is 0%. And whilst in the OzPAR for the Pfizer pediatric product, it was stated that there were no reports of adverse events of special interest in young people in the clinical trial, however, that it was in fact known to the TGA that by the approval date of December 7th, 2021, that there were a total of 399 reports of these adverse events of special interest in Australian young people aged under 18 to the TGA DAEN database, including 2 cases where death was a reported outcome. And there have in fact been multiple cases of deaths reported in young children, several of those where the TGA appears to have described these as causal from the vaccines based on Freedom of Information documents. And importantly, the TGA was required to convene VSIG for all serious and unexpected adverse events after vaccination, and particularly for those where public confidence could be compromised. And instead, the TGA has allegedly attempted to withhold these assessments from the public and has not called VSIG for these or thousands of other serious adverse events reported. Lastly, and without getting too philosophical, I would like to recognise some of the good that has come from this horror. I have seen the greatest strength and courage from those who are injured and bereaved, who have been able to selflessly advocate for and assist others who are suffering. And so many who have given their time, energy and money to fight for and care for their fellow human beings. There has been almost a spiritual movement and an awakening, as so many are turning away from big pharma and big medicine, and finding strength and meaning and faith in their lives and freeing themselves from the fear that has allowed for the control of humanity over the past few years. Many are now looking at that fear squarely and calling it for what it was and is, an evil and a horror that justified the most atrocious behaviour towards even our own families, friends and colleagues. From Matthew 10:26, therefore do not fear them, for there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, and nothing hidden that will not be known.